Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue au Bracket Show. Donc, Bruno en direct de Confoo et je suis accompagné de Patrick, un de mes collègues chez Don Techno. Et nous recevons Lauren Schaefer et Joe Karlsson. Both of you, hi.
Hey.
Hello.
How are you?
Doing well. How about you?
Pretty good. Pretty
Thanks
good.
for having us. We appreciate
Yes.
it. I'm doing terrible. It's awful. It's fine. It's going great. It's going great.
All right. So before we get into the subject, maybe take a few moments to tell us a bit about yourself, both of you.
You can go
I'm
first,
letting
Lauren.
you. All right, Lauren first.
All right. So my name is Lauren Schaefer. I am based in Pennsylvania, which is on the East Coast of the U.S. I currently work for MongoDB as a developer advocate. I started my career out at IBM, and I spent 8 years as a software engineer there, doing a variety of different things, which was a lot of fun. Over to you, Joe.
Lauren, that was so tight. I get asked this question every time I do an interview, and I feel like I'm a deer staring off into headlights. What do I say? Who am I? I'm like, should I give it?
What's your favorite color?
Exactly. I was born back in I don't know what people care about. I worked for bestbuy.com. I did that I was the technical lead for that, which you may not know this. It's one of the biggest sites in North America. We had some Black Friday traffic, so that's always really fun. Lauren and I both work for that little database company called MongoDB. We're both developer advocates, and we both write, make videos, work on documentation, work on fun projects, whatever. We get to do really fun stuff for that. As long as it involves a database that happens to involve MongoDB, Lauren and I can basically do that thing, whatever that is.
Are you at the same office when it's allowed to be in physically the same office?
We wish. She's in Philly. I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's both snowy here. I'm guessing it's still pretty snowy in Montreal too. But yeah. So we're all remote, which is nice. Like I think most DevRel teams are pretty distributed. Our team is no exception. So like COVID didn't really affect us really at all.
Well, I mean, it's
okay.
In that way.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. We're not speaking at Confoo this year in person, anyways.
There was no impact on the day-to-day job.
Yeah, we do miss being in person at conferences, though. Mm-hmm. That's a big miss.
Yeah, or even remote teams in general. Like we usually do offsites to meet up, and we have some people on our team that have been with us for like a year now I've never met, and they've never met anyone on the team. So that's kind of weird. Mm-hmm. It'd be nice to meet them in real life someday, maybe.
Actually, Patrick is one of those guys that works with us and never even set foot inside the building.
Patrick.
So I worked for them about 6 months ago, and then I never met nobody from that company right now.
Classic.
It's kind of weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like weird to connect. I don't know. I feel like that. I feel bad for some of our new members. And like Lauren and I, we got to know each other in person before COVID hit. Mm-hmm. So like we have there's a little bit of rapport there, but there's some and I have rapport too with people I know virtually too. It's just different though, you know? Mm-hmm. And Patrick, not I'm sure everyone loves you and it's great, but it's it's just different, you know?
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah. All right. So maybe I can let you go ahead, Patrick, with the first question.
That's good. I'll go ahead. So first of all, for all those who don't know what it is, can you explain what is the main purpose of MongoDB?
Lauren, I feel like you got a great answer to this.
I hope I nail it then. MongoDB is a wildly popular document database. It's a general purpose database. So a lot of times when people think about MongoDB, they think maybe it's, for some niche use cases, but it's really great for a wide variety of use cases and industries. And it makes working with your data really, really easy.
That's the perfect answer.
Nothing to add, Joe?
Good.
No, that's great. We're database.
All right. Well, a lot of developers are used to working with more relational databases like SQL Server, MySQL, and are actually used to it. What kind of knowledge is needed to move on into NoSQL, MongoDB to get up and running in your application?
Lauren and I are both experts on this. We do a lot of talks on, because I think that's true for most developers. They're and Lauren and I, we're trying to meet people where they're at. We know they're coming from SQL worlds, and we're trying to shepherd them into our universe. And MongoDB is weird because like we give weird names to everything, but it's basically the same thing on SQL. So it's like a little bit of like a mental hurdle, and there's a little bit differences with like schema design, but it's mostly the same. We just make it a little more complicated, I think, than it should be.
I think one of the important things to know is, when you start looking at the terminology, you might think, oh, a row might map to a document and a column might map to a field. And so you kind of start doing that terminology mapping. And so your instinct might be to just say, oh, I'm going to convert all of my rows to documents. I'm going to just think about it in the same way. And it does require a bit of a shift in mindset. There are different patterns you use when you model your data. And so from that perspective, you do want to take a little bit of time to learn how to model your data and those sorts of best practices. But once you kind of get the hang of it, I personally feel like it's a lot easier way to think about modeling your data. And it simplifies the programming process for me, which was really surprising when I started using it.
Okay.
Good. Talking about the pattern and anti-pattern, before we diving into it, maybe you could tell us in which scenario we should consider a NoSQL DB like MongoDB?
Lauren mentioned this, like we're general purpose. I think there are cases where it works really great though. Like time series databases, game design, e-commerce stores for like caching, product information that you're going to be showing. Analytics is another popular use case. You can make full CRUD apps though. Like I think it's a common misconception that you can't be making like complex relationships, right? You're just modeling those relationships a little bit differently, and there's different pros and cons you have to be weighing into it. So it really is a great general purpose database. And there are industries that love it, like for specific reasons though, that are much better apt at handling that data.
So even though we're talking about performance or a huge data set, MongoDB should be applied to it also?
Oh, for sure.
You're just saying like if we have a lot of data, could you use MongoDB? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, Lauren, add to this too, but like I feel like the thing that differentiates us is scalability. Like that's the old joke, right? MongoDB is web scale. Like I think that still holds true. Like we can still, like the joke, haha, we get it. But like also we do handle data really well. And that's like, we can do horizontal sharding, and you can do that with like SQL databases, but has anyone ever actually done it or like looked at how to do it? It's a pain. It's a horrible pain. Like it's just so easy with MongoDB. Yeah, indexing, finding data, reads, writes, super fast. I don't know. Yeah, it's super great at handling massive amounts of data.
Okay. How do you, let's say you start a project and you decide to go with MongoDB. How do you prepare your project in order to have a solid architecture that will fit with your database? Because it's probably a different thinking than if you're just doing the typical relational database.
Right. I feel like when you're using a relational database, you kind of just map out your data and you kind of, maybe you're going to get it down to third normal form and you kind of get like your right model. And that's a little bit, it's different when you switch to MongoDB. You really want to think about your particular use case. So you want to say, what queries am I going to be running most frequently? How am I going to be updating the data most frequently? What data am I going to be retrieving? And that's what you want to optimize for. Another big consideration is, how do you think it's going to scale, right? Like if you think you've got, a many relationship, one to many, maybe that's going in an array. If you're going into like one to squillions, which is a crazy word, but right, if it's going to be massive, maybe you don't want to put that in an array. So kind of thinking through what your data, so think through, what your relationships are and how you're going to be querying the data.
Yeah, she nailed it. That's like the most important thing is just like Bruno, you and I might have the same data for our to-do app. We may be saying the same exact things, but we might be using that data differently. And you'd actually be modeling that data differently on our applications because we're using that data differently, even though it's the same data. And I think traditionally with normalization, with like RDBMSs, you're just looking at what data do I have and how can I split that up? But we need to be looking at how are we using this data and how can we optimize performance with our schema.
So in applications that use event sourcing, obviously there's a big advantage with read models and write models.
I'm sorry, did you say models with what? I just didn't.
With event sourcing? I don't know what that is.
Well, when you have basically that you're doing command query separation, that you're writing to a collection or a database and having another copy or actually a different view of your data to just be reading it. So I'm guessing this is a big advantage that you can do effectively in MongoDB.
Oh, you're saying like in SQL databases, you have to do this like duplication for optimizing for reads sometimes?
Well, actually, in SQL, what you do is have views that you basically change how you expose your data, but you're still doing some transformation to get the view that's accessible, as opposed to what I've seen in a system I worked before that we did command queries. So we just emitted commands that wrote data into a MongoDB database. And then there was something, I can't remember what exactly, that transformed it into another MongoDB database that was only our read model. That was only the place where we just read the data.
Yeah.
So no mix and match. It's just we get it out, and we show it.
We actually have a built-in feature we just came out that's called Online Archive, but it moves your data into a read-only cluster for it's cheaper, and then you can still do a query on that single point like origin. So you don't have to like do any like weird rules against that now, which makes it super easy. But yeah, you can still do that by hand. That's totally possible. And I know people do that too with like using MongoDB as like a faster front end for a SQL database than like copying that over. Like you can do crazy stuff like that too. Love it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Are there maybe about the whole architecture thing, are there pitfalls that we can get into while designing our application that once you're a bit more far into the project, you'll realize that you made a mistake, a huge one?
Lauren's the expert on this. She wrote a whole thing on what not to do.
Okay. Are you saying I'm the expert because I get myself into a mess all the time?
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
okay. So there are pitfalls that people commonly fall into. And so we call these schema design anti-patterns. And so if you Google them, you'll find I've got a blog series and a video series that goes into these in detail. And I've got a talk tomorrow on this as well. So there are several different pitfalls people fall into. Let's see, one of them is creating too many indexes, having a massive number of indexes, right? So like indexes are good. You should definitely create indexes, right? Indexes will speed up your read queries, but in turn, they can slow down your write queries. So sometimes, you might have an inclination. You're like, well, I don't know what I'm going to query on. I'm just going to create an index on every field. You don't want to do that, right? You want to be very intentional with creating your indexes and make sure you're really optimizing for your use case. And so maybe you're catching a theme that I'll probably say over and over, but it really is all about what your use case is and how your application is going to use the data.
And that's true for RDBMSs too, for SQL databases too. You don't want to. Did you guys see the thread on Twitter yesterday of say something that pisses off a DBA? I
haven't seen it.
I saw someone say that index all your fields.
So maybe because we spoke briefly about anti-patterns, do you have a quick examples of other anti-patterns in MongoDB and maybe how to avoid them actually other than the indexes one?
Yeah, so another anti-pattern that we like to talk about is separating data that is accessed together. So I know we hinted on this a bit earlier, but there can be, when you're coming from relational database background, you sort of have that inclination to split up your data. So even for something simple like inputting your contact information, you might have a table for your, your name, and then a different table for if you've multiple addresses, and then a different table for maybe your hobbies or your job history. And most likely when you're using MongoDB, you're probably going to want to combine that information into a single document. So each user is going to have all of their name, their job history, their addresses, all in a single document. And it can be a little tough to get used to at first, because if you're used to separating your data, you might be inclined to create different collections, just like you would have created different tables, but that's going to slow down your queries. So you really want to optimize for your use case. And the rule of thumb that we talk about is data that is accessed together should be stored together. So it sounds so obvious, But like when you actually start to do it, you're like, oh yes, I really got to think about my use case. How am I going to use it? Data that is accessed together should be stored together.
No, that's perfect. That's the number one thing I see is people trying to turn their data like into SQL normalized data. And I get it. I've had the impulse to. I've done it before. Before I started working for MongoDB, I didn't know any better. That's what Lauren and I try to do. Just fix that problem as broadly as we can. It's not the end of the world. You can do it, but like you're not using a database that's rows and columns. You're using a document-based database. Like you're totally missing the point and taking advantage of what it's capable of and what a SQL database can't do. You know?
Mm-hmm. Cool.
So in the meantime, while modeling your DB foundation, are there any tools that can help you identify anti-patterns? Or let's say you have an existing database with MongoDB. Are you able to just launch a tool, get some information about what's going wrong with your database or something?
I love that you asked this. So MongoDB Atlas is MongoDB's database as a service. And they added a feature, I think last summer. If you're using Atlas, you can go in and there's a tab actually called Schema Anti-Patterns. And you can click on it and it'll be like, hey, you've got too many collections. Hey, you've got too many indexes. I'm trying to think of, there's several that it'll flag for you, which is super handy. So yeah, go give Atlas a try and you can see it'll flag it for you right away.
Wait, even
let me write it down. Atlas, you said, huh?
What's that?
Let me write it down. You said Atlas, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. If you don't want to like host your own MongoDB database, we have a free forever always dev tier too. So that's pretty nice. Yeah. And we also have a performance advisor. So like, hey, you're querying this index or this field a lot. You might want to put an index on it, or like, hey, you haven't indexed, or we don't see many queries here anymore. You may want to pop the index off, like helping that out. Can I make some bold, wild, unsubstantiated claims or like predictions about the future? And I'm going to speak about this as Joe and not as Joe Karlsson, a MongoDB employee. But I think that the database of the future, like, okay, let's take a step back, right? People just want to save data and get it back quickly, and we don't have to worry about it. Like, no one really cares about setting infrastructure. As developers, I don't have to worry about that. I think the databases of the future are going to be, managed by AI. And we're already starting to see that with like our performance advisors and scheme advisors. I'm not saying like we're even working on this or anything, but I think the best, like the databases are going to win the future. The ones that like auto manage your data, auto manage your schemas, auto index, auto shard, auto scale. Like you can throw some data in and it'll manage it for you. We're not there yet, but I think we're totally heading in that direction.
Could it go as far as suggesting how your code should reflect this? Your models in your application?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, people have been trying to figure out how to replace coders with AI for 60 years. I don't think that hasn't stopped anytime soon. I think it's going to be a while before that actually happens. But absolutely, like, hey, we recommend the schema design. You may want to update your code, or like, yeah, you know what I mean? Like, we're not there yet, but I could totally see that happening.
Let's jump for us.
But that's the beauty of it, right? Like I know I work for a database company, but I don't like getting in and fine tuning all those little things. Like I like building my application and then it all just kind of working, right? Like I don't self-host a MongoDB database on my computer. I'm using Atlas, so I don't have to manage it. And developers want to be able to move quickly. You want to get that business advantage. So I think that is the direction we're moving. I don't want to be down in the details.
Right. My next question, I'll maybe wait for Joe to come back from his other freeze, because I'd like to hear you both on this one. It's a funny one.
Should I be nervous?
No. Well, maybe meanwhile, I might have another question that we can start on this, and maybe Joe can chip in after. From a coding perspective, like in your application you're developing that's using Mongo, since a document can always evolve, there's new properties, new fields, new anything in your document, what can you do to ensure you still can read it all from your code? Because your model will change. So that can be
yes. So I think this is one of the biggest advantages of using a NoSQL database over a traditional relational database is you have that flexibility to be able to change your schema, right? We all know requirements change, it happens, and you got to figure out how to deal with it. So yeah, you do have that flexibility. You can add fields on the fly and it's totally fine. And it'll freak you out initially, but it will be fine. But when you are ready to lock down your schema, MongoDB provides schema validation. So you can say, you know, I want my documents to be of this format. They need to have these fields. Those fields need to be of this type. And you can choose whether or not to throw warnings or errors if a document doesn't meet that validation. So you get a lot of flexibility. And you can also choose whether you want to apply your validation to just documents that already meet the specifications or every document in your database. So you get a lot of flexibility with how rigid you want to be with enforcing that schema validation, but it is there when you're ready to lock down your schema.
But from the application perspective, say I'm writing a C# backend. Once you add a field or remove a field from your Mongo schema, you'll have to leave it in your C# class, for example, because you can't remove it if there's one document in your database that contains this value, right? So how do you manage this kind of versioning, but from the code perspective?
So there is a schema design pattern specifically on how to version your database. I don't know, Joe, do you get into the schema versioning pattern at all in your talk?
No, I don't. We could totally touch on it though. Yeah, too advanced for my talk.
Okay, too advanced.
Yeah.
But yeah,
it's tricky because you don't want to end up removing a property from one of your models in your application, and then once you try to read a document that had this property.
Yeah, so there is a schema versioning pattern, and the idea is basically you can set, you know, whatever schema version inside of your document, and then your application code will handle that gracefully. So you kind of program it into your application code.
Okay. So you could say, for example, one property is only on version 1 of the schema. So if you're retrieving a document that's on this version, it will be used correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the last questions I have, maybe Patrick will have other ones after, but the last one I have, because you're obviously big fans of MongoDB, you're working there. Are there situations where you think a relational database is more worth it? The answer might be no, but
I have not encountered that. I think, again, the common thing that you see is like people saying like, oh, you can't build a social network on it because you can't have, you can't do joins, right? But so here's some things that people don't really know about MongoDB. We support ACID transactions. We even support them on sharded clusters. We support joins across different collections. You can do like advanced data modeling with those and like create those relationships. I have not encountered a situation where I need to have an RDBMS. We have healthcare providers that are using us for HIPAA compliant code. We have banks that are using us now, like government organizations are using us too. So it can work at scale. It can work for like massive like industries that typically require more rigid data structuring. But yeah, I don't know. I think the industry's moving that way.
Cool. I totally agree with everything Joe just said. I'm going to caveat it. If you're already on a relational database,
yes,
it might not be worth the effort to migrate. If you've got a legacy application with a lot of code, it's going to be a lot of work to migrate. But if you're starting from scratch, I don't know. The one use case that I think is a little trickier is when you start getting into very specialized use cases for things like graph databases.
Yeah.
Sometimes graph databases have their benefits. Like if you're trying to model, relationships between the data, if you want to do a recommendation engine, if you want to do social networks, those sorts of things, graph databases do have their advantage. So no, I'm not recommending a relational database, but sometimes there are some special use cases where you might want to pick a graph database or augment your MongoDB database with a graph database.
Yeah, or key value stores. Like I still use Redis for saving user tokens for if I roll my own auth engine. In-memory key value stores work great too. You could do that. It's faster and it's in memory. So there's different pros and cons. And I love Lauren brought up the like we have a culture of using SQL or MySQL or whatever. Cool. Like we'll have to retrain 400 DBAs to use MongoDB. That's probably not worth it. That's probably not a good.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think your culture should dictate, like it should be part of the thing that dictates your stack. It shouldn't be the only thing, but it's a huge part of it that devs don't talk about enough. I'm so glad Lauren brought that up. All
right. So that's all the questions we had. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Joe. That was really interesting. We don't talk enough about MongoDB. Well, I know for what I do, I'm mostly in the habits of using SQL Server.
Yeah.
So definitely worth thinking about it and trying it out more than just saying we're used to what we do.
All I'll say about it is like, I think in my experience, a lot of people haven't like touched MongoDB in the last couple of years, and a lot's changed. And a lot of the things that you might think are wrong with it have probably been fixed. Yeah, I don't know. It's worth taking a second look at. We're biased though too, so take everything we say with a grain of salt.
Yeah, but it's still pretty good advice. It's definitely worth trying it out, especially if it's been a while since the last time you tried.
Yeah. Well, I know I had a blast talking to all y'all. This has been so much fun. And Lauren and I, we just love like any chance we can get to like just chat with people about the thing we love the most. Well, we're all on it. We love it.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks both of you for your time. It was a pleasure. Thanks, Patrick, for helping me with the interview.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.